Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now it's been 7 years since Red Dead Redemption 2 launched on consoles and 6 years since it came to PC. It still looks fantastic in my opinion, and because of its age you don't need a high-end PC to run it with respectable visuals and decent frame rates. I've tested it on a wide range of hardware over the years, and today I want to test it on a few graphics card-less solutions. That's right, we'll be testing RDR2 on nothing but integrated graphics, and to do that I have a few test rigs that I'd like to take the challenge, and the first features the Athlon 3000G. Now the Athlon 3000G has 2 cores, 4 threads and integrated Vega 3 graphics. I think this released around about the same time as the game. I remember testing it back in the day, but one thing is for certain, and we do need to overclock this little chip in order to get the most from it. So by default this is going to run at 3.5 GHz. I overclocked the CPU portion of the chip to 4 GHz, and when it comes to the Vega 3 by default this will run at 1100 and I overclocked it to 1650. I'm using 32 gigs of DDR4. I reserved 8 gigs of memory for the VRAM, and the figures you see on screen, the VRAM usage and usage process, they are worth ignoring because Red Dead Redemption 2 always just says a few hundred megabytes for whatever reason, no matter the iGPU that I'm testing. So to begin with, the 3000G with the overclocked Vega 3 graphics, 27 FPS at 720p. Now I use the ultra textures with everything else set to lowest and TAA high. You might be wondering, that's a strange choice, but turning TAA off and lowering the textures didn't really make a difference, nor did enabling FSR, and for some reason dropping the resolution scale didn't do much either. Weird, but not quite playable. 30 FPS in some places, but overall slightly less. I then switched to the Ryzen 3 3200G. Now this is a 4-core CPU with 4 threads, and it launched alongside the 3400G, which has 8 threads. Now at the time there wasn't much difference between the two in a lot of games, but these days the 3400G is definitely going to benefit from the extra 4 threads, and when it comes to the CPU side of things, this may struggle a little bit. When it comes to Red Dead 2, however, with the Vega 8 iGPU this time around, we're seeing 31 FPS at 900p, so we've bumped that resolution up. I've also overclocked the Vega 8 iGPU from, I believe it's 1250 by default to 1600. I tried 1700, but we were getting all these weird artifacts all over the place, and then the system crashed. So 1600 megahertz is the place to be here, is the limit I think for this. Ultra textures, everything else set to lowest, same as before, TAA high for 31 frames per second, and percentile lows that aren't too bad, although as before you will see some dips and drops below 30, though a lot of the time you're going to see an average above that, and that's what I was targeting with all of my iGPUs today, apart from the last tested system, but we'll get on to that momentarily. Now we're making the switch to the Ryzen 7 8700G. I need a few APUs to sort of fill the gap between the lower end and the higher end stuff. I'd like to get my hands on a 5600G again and feature that on the channel a lot more, but for now let's look at the AM5 socket 8700G, 8 cores and 16 threads. This one has 780M graphics clocked at 2900 MHz. I managed to overclock them ever so slightly to 3100. I'm using DDR5 clocked at 6400 MHz in dual channel, 32 gigs of the stuff. Again, 8 gigs reserved for the memory, but you can't really get an idea of how much memory it's using because the figures are weird. Now with the 8700G we get access to newer drivers, and with the newer drivers we get a few more issues like micro stuttering. Every so often there's a little jump in the frame time graph. Not sure if you can pick it up here, but this is worth mentioning. That said, the average is 57 FPS. This is at 1080p this time around with the ultra textures, all else lowest once again, and TAA set to high. It's a pretty decent experience, but when it comes to the percentile lows of 43 and 33, well, I do think these could do with some improving. If we move on to the console equivalent settings, now these are the settings outlined by Digital Foundry back in the day of the Xbox One X, whatever it was. Yeah, that is what we're working with in terms of console equivalent settings here, albeit at 1080p instead of the native 4K that console surprisingly output at the time. If we switch to the console equivalent settings, the game is going to look a lot better, and we only drop a few frames per second. It's like 52 instead of 57. The 1% low drops to 32, however, and the 0.1% low drops to 29, but again we are seeing a few intermittent stutters here and there, and I think they are more noticeable this time around. So in order to combat this, here's what we need to do. First of all, we need to turn off resizable bar. This isn't as important from what I've noticed, and the main thing I'd suggest doing would be to turn async compute on. After all these years, I finally figured out how to make Red Dead Redemption 2 smoother on integrated graphics. So in order to enable async compute, we need to go to the Documents folder, Rockstar Games, Red Dead Redemption 2 and Settings. Then we need to open the System XML file using, I don't know, it can just be Notepad if you want to. I opened this up and then searched for async using Control F, typed in async, and we're going to see this option, async compute enabled value equals false. We want to change this to true with AMD iGPUs, and once we've done that, well, you're going to notice an improvement with the consistency. At least I did. So it's worth a try in my opinion. For example, with the same console equivalent settings and async compute enabled, we are seeing 49 frames per second. Now, I know what you're thinking, this is a drop from what we were seeing before. We were seeing 52, but we've dropped 3 frames and we're only seeing 49 on average. That being said, the 1 and 0.1% lows were better, 42 and 39 compared to 32 and 29, and the micro stuttering was gone. Now, I'd argue that consistency is actually more important than a higher average, especially when the average is this close to what it was before, and overall this is a far smoother experience. I don't really want to target 60 FPS with this chip. I think we're going to need too much of a visual sacrifice in order to hit this. FSR2 doesn't really help in this one, I've noticed. I'm just grateful that we can hit at least 40 frames per second, to be honest, pretty much all of the time, and it's going to feel nice and smooth with the 780M iGPU. I then decided to bump things up to 1440p with the same console equivalent settings and async compute still enabled to see if we could retain at least 30 FPS, and to my surprise we did. 34 was the average, the 1% low was 28 and the 0.1% low was 27, so pretty consistent again in terms of the percentile lows, and I think that's thanks to the async compute option that we enabled from the System XML file. Yeah, this definitely feels a lot better to play now. Now, before we move on to the most powerful system of the day, I wanted to take a quick look at what Intel integrated graphics were capable of. Here we have the i3-12300. Now, this is a 4-core, 8-thread chip with UHD 730 graphics. Couldn't really tweak anything here from within my BIOS because I'm using an H610M board. It's a really basic DDR4 motherboard. Again, 32 gigs of DDR4 clocked at 3200 MHz. We needed to run this at 720p this time around with 80% res scale in order to hit 31 FPS. Interestingly, res scale made a difference here. With the AMD 3000G, it didn't, yet when I dropped to 80% here, we gained about 2 or 3 FPS, but that made all the difference because we were seeing 31 frames per second. Dropping from ultra textures to low didn't make much of a difference, and I kept things at ultra, otherwise they can just end up looking like a blurry mess in some places. TAA was also set to high, and overall it wasn't the best experience, of course, but it was more consistent than I anticipated, and if you don't mind making your eyeballs hurt, then I guess you could play it like this. When we move away from towns like Valentine, for example, then things will pick up a little bit. It wasn't as bad as I was anticipating, put it that way. Now then, we are going to move on to the most powerful system of the day, the Minisforum MS-S1 Max. This has a Ryzen AI Max Plus 395 with Radeon 8060S graphics. Now, for a bit of context, we've tested this before and found that the integrated 8060S can compete with the likes of the RTX 4060 from Nvidia. We ran a few comparisons in another video and found that this iGPU actually beat the 4060 in a few instances, and I'm not sure how it's going to compare to the 4060 here, but all I know is that at 1080p with the same console equivalent settings, with async compute enabled, of course, we were seeing 98 frames per second. You may remember when I tested this one initially, there were a few dips and drops. Now that we have this async compute option enabled, yeah, it's got rid of all those micro stutters that we were getting before. Still not really an accurate reading in terms of VRAM and VRAM usage process, but everything else, the utilization, temperature and power, is all accurate, I think. I was then able to increase things to 1440p with the same settings enabled, so the console equivalent settings once again. We didn't actually lose much in terms of performance, about 10, 12 FPS, 85 this time around with a 1% low of 56 and a 0.1% low of 48. So there were a few more dips and drops this time, but to be honest, a very surprising result. 1440p from an iGPU with the console equivalent settings, not bad at all. This system is going to use around about 130 watts of power maximum. I'm not sure if that's the default limit or just the limit of this machine for the sake of heat, but pretty impressive anyway. Now to finalise, I stuck with the 8060S system, but I turned things up to high. So I kept the textures at ultra, turned all the other options up to high/on, and here we were still seeing a very nice 69 FPS. This is still with 1440p resolution as well, and the 8060S gives us a good look at what we can expect, I think, from the future of integrated graphics. I think it'll become more commonplace, hopefully, and hopefully not as pricey as part of certain systems too. But 69 FPS, 1% low of 50, and a 0.1% low of 46. So very impressive from this machine, but in fairness, I was also pretty impressed with the 3000G. I wasn't expecting it to hit at least 20 FPS, let alone 27. And for the i3-12300 as well, 31 frames per second with that, albeit more of a visual sacrifice there. If you've got an 8700G, 8600G, anything like that, a modern AM5 APU, you're also going to have a pretty good time with Red Dead 2 in 2025. I think all that's missing really is something like a 5600G or 5700G, which I hope to get soon, and then we can throw that back into the integrated graphics benchmarks. But as for this one, Red Dead Redemption 2, 6 years on PC, doesn't require a graphics card to have a good time, and even if we ignore the result from the really high-end Ryzen AI system, yeah, not a bad set of results, I don't think, at all. It's well worth a try if you have this game and you have an iGPU, put it that way. Thanks for watching then, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.